Good evening. It's just about 6 p.m. in the nation's capital. My name's Garland Nixon. The name of this show is News Views, and I'm on every Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. with plenty to talk about, Follow me online at Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, just plain old Garland Nixon on Facebook. You can email me, garlandin@gmail.com. And of course, as you probably already know, most of my listeners know, people that have been hanging out with Garland for years know, I've got a YouTube show that I enjoy doing, do lots of stuff on that, mostly foreign policy. That's what I really like. That's what I really enjoy, talking about foreign policy. And of course, Rockfin, which is like YouTube, only better. ROKFIN.com, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. And I like it better because A, it's a free speech platform, and B, no advertisements. All right. So today we're going to talk. I've got a friend of mine on, brilliant guy. He's an author and he's a political analyst. And, you know, I always learn a lot from him, a guy who's knowledgeable about a lot of historical facts. Caleb Maupin. Caleb, welcome to, well, I don't think you've been here before. You've been on KPFK. Caleb, welcome back welcome to WPFW.
Sure. Glad to be here.
So, Caleb, let's talk. We got plenty to talk about, and I do want to open up the phones at some point, take some calls. But here's why I like Caleb Maupin to come on. Socialism is the word. Socialism, socialism, socialism. You know, I recall a while back, and I won't get into it, but I remember watching a documentary, and there was a person saying, who had a T-shirt on that said, Obama is a socialist. And whoever that was doing the documentary walked up to him, stuck a mic in their face and said, okay, what's a socialist? And the guy said, well, it's kind of like Hitler, but it's kind of like Stalin. And then he picks up his phone. He says, let me call my brother-in-law. He'll know. So here's the bottom line. In America, people are trained to intuitively, to ideologically hate socialism. There's only one problem. They don't know what it is. I'm sure you do. You're a person who advocates for socialism. I kind of am learning about what it is. I like to have knowledge about something before I make an idiot out of myself and say I do or don't like it. And I think it's a good idea to bring Caleb Maupin on. So Caleb, let's talk. If you can explain, let's do this. Explain what, as you understand it, what is capitalism? What is socialism? What's the difference between the two?
Well, capitalism is when production is carried out for profit. Capitalism is a society where the drive to make profit by private owners defines how the economy functions. Under capitalism, we don't have houses because people need shelter. We have houses so that landlords and banks can make money. We don't have food so people can eat it. We have food so that agribusiness and big box stores can make money selling it. Capitalism is production organized for profit. Socialism is when the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power are organized to serve the people. It's when you have a government that forces the economy to work in the interest of the people by controlling the major centers of economic power, the means of production. And in doing so, they can ensure that growth continues. Socialism is why China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to now being the second largest economy in the world. Socialism built Russia up to being a country that was strong enough to invent space travel and defeat the Nazis and electrify itself and raise millions of people out of poverty. Socialism is why the Cubans have a higher life expectancy than most people throughout Latin America and throughout the Caribbean. Socialism is the reorganization of the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
Interesting. Yeah, what somebody said to me one time is, well, if you want to understand the socialism versus capitalism, why do you build a house? You build a house in capitalism because the people who are building the house are going to make money. The people who are going to sell the house, they're going to make money. The people who are going to do the loan for the house, they're going to make money. On, and you can go to all the different groups that are going to make money. In socialism, you build a house because people need houses. And that's why in a poor, relatively poor socialist country like Venezuela right now, it's poor because of the U.S. is, only poor because the U.S. has attacked it economically with brutal sanctions. They've given away 4 million houses. They've built and given away 4 million houses for free because people need a place to live. And in America, every bridge and tunnel you go past in some states and every overpass, there's shanty towns and tents where the homeless live. Yet we've got tens, if not hundreds of, at least tens of millions of unoccupied homes and apartments.
Sure. I can give you four things that would happen if we had a socialist government that would be different than what we have now. One of the first things that a socialist government in America would do would be to hire millions of unemployed people and put them to work rebuilding the country, repaving the roads and the highways, building new high-speed railway, building nice new schools and universities for our youth, rebuilding the power plants and the water treatment facilities. There would be a mass mobilization to rebuild the country. Secondly, in a socialist society, the natural resources of the United States, the oil, the gas, the coal, the timber, these would be the property of everyone. And the profits that are made from our natural resources would go into the public budget. It would be the country getting wealthier as oil comes out of the ground, as natural gas comes out of the ground, as coal is extracted, as trees are cut down. All the wealth of the natural resources would go into the public budget to make the country wealthier. Socialist society would have a national bank that strategically lended money in order to make the economy stronger and make sure that we continue to have economic growth, and would supply credit to people to buy homes or to people to start businesses in accordance with the overall vision to make the country more prosperous. I also think a socialist society would have an economic bill of rights. Franklin Roosevelt, in his last State of the Union address, proposed an economic bill of rights to be added to the Constitution: the right to a job, the right to health care, the right to an education. And adding these things to the Constitution, an economic bill of rights. Those four steps, if you can imagine a government that would do those four things, that's what imagining socialism in the United States would be like. And I do think that 21st century socialism, like you saw in Venezuela, like they have in China, like they have in Vietnam and other places, does have a role for the market sector, for private companies, for independent cooperatives, etc. But the idea is that the economy is not left to care for itself. Right? We have a government that steps in and takes action on behalf of the people. I've often argued that, like as a parent, if they don't feed their child, they're not giving their child proper food, or if it's wintertime and their child is going to school without hats and gloves on, that parent can actually be arrested. And they won't be arrested for doing anything, but for not doing anything. The crime is criminal neglect. Well, it's pretty clear that the government of the United States is at this time guilty of criminal neglect. Our bridges and roads are falling apart. People are living in homeless encampments all across the country. We have an opioid epidemic. Water is not being properly purified. Our government is in complete dereliction of duty. And we need a government of action, a government that will take action to control the economy, to make life better for the people. And that would be moving towards socialism in the United States.
One of the things that that caused me to ask this question, as you know, in my political training, my mentor was Paul Robeson Jr., and I know that Paul Robeson said he never became any part of any party, but he said that he advocated for socialism, right? And I always wondered, man, Paul Robeson was a smart guy. He advocated for socialism, blah, 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 right? And I had the opportunity, as you know, to travel, and I had been told Venezuela is horrible. Maduro is an evil dictator, and the country's just a terrible, and everything there is terrible, blah, blah, blah. And so I traveled, and I had the opportunity to travel around and talk to people. And what I found was the problems in Venezuela were not because of Maduro. It was because of the United States sanctions trying to destroy a socialist country. And that when I asked, I talked to people about the free houses. I said, so they give away free houses. How's that work? And what they said to me was, well, you have to sign up with the government. And of course, it goes to women who have children and no husband first. They get first dibs. And then they went on older people, and then how it goes down, blah, 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 who gets it first. And I said, well, what about electricity and things like that? And they didn't even understand what I said, what I was asking them. And I was like, well, how do they pay for electricity? And they said, pay for electricity. That's considered a human right here. And I'm like, oh, well, no wonder the United States wants to tell us all that Venezuela is terrible and it's horrible, and all these socialist countries, they have to tell us it's terrible and horrible. But if you actually travel to Nicaragua, where you go into a hospital and there's a sign in the hospital that says, if anybody tries to charge you for anything, call this government number and they will be prosecuted. No wonder the government of the United States has to try to take these countries out and always tell us how evil socialism is.
Sure. Well, before Venezuela started moving towards socialism, they only had 12 public universities. Now they have 32. They wiped out illiteracy in the country. It used to be that, especially in the mountains and in the rural areas, there was a lot of adult illiteracy. They have wiped out illiteracy in Venezuela. They have also done a huge amount to eradicate unemployment. I walked through a neighborhood in central Caracas where every single house was paid for by an interest-free loan provided by the government. And before that, people lived in shacks without running water and without electricity. These are real economic measures to improve people's lives. And that's why the United States has moved in to try and cripple Venezuela's economy and to just drive them off the world market and make them a pariah and make it hard for them to import food, etc. The United States very much is threatened by countries breaking free, taking control of their economy, and using state control of the means of production to raise up people's living standards. When you really think about it, when you talk about imperialism is holding back development. They want the whole world to be impoverished and a captive market. They want the whole world to be buying their oil not from Venezuela, but from Chevron and BP and Shell and ExxonMobil. And when Venezuela broke free and started selling oil themselves on the international markets and using the oil profits to build up socialism in their country, Venezuela became an enemy. Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were a deeply impoverished country, and that's when the United States loved Russia. Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton were buddies, and there was all kinds of privatizations. The economy was in ruins, but when Putin came in and put oil and gas under public ownership and Russia became a strong country that was competing with Wall Street on the oil market, suddenly they didn't like Russia again. It's a very similar story, and all the countries the USA has attacked and overthrown have all been competitors. Iraq was a major oil exporting country before the USA invaded in 2003 and blew the country to shreds. Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent under the leadership of Gaddafi. They had built the world's largest irrigation system. They were talking about creating an independent currency for Africa, and that's why they were destroyed. And we have it in our heads that Western capitalism, that these American companies, when they go into developing countries, they make them wealthier. They start the process of civilizing them and bringing industrialization and development. They do the opposite. They hold back economic development. That's generally the effect of domination by Wall Street. The IMF and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, these institutions, they grind countries into poverty. They put their local businesses out of business, and they force them to become impoverished clients of Wall Street. And what's interesting is I think a lot of Americans are waking up and seeing that. A lot of Trump people don't like globalism because they realize the same thing that these big corporations have done all over Africa and all over Asia and Latin America. They're now doing to Pennsylvania and Ohio and Alabama and Texas and Utah. They are impoverishing the United States, and they are, grinding the world into poverty so that a few big banks and multinational corporations can enrich themselves. They're building a high-tech, low-wage economy, and there's many people in the United States that don't like it. And when they resist that, they're doing the same thing the Venezuelans and the Cubans and the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians are doing. It's one global struggle against these giant ultra-monopolies.
What's interesting, and that is Malcolm X, and he very much talked about black people in the United States in the same way that he talked about black people in other countries outside of the United States, and said the United States used the same kind of oppressive tactics against them, etc. Well, we know now certain things. For instance, we know that one of the things that the Drug Administration, DEA, did was they made a deal in Colombia with the Cali cartel, so that they could take out the Medellin cartel. And the deal was the Cali cartel could import drugs into the U.S. and they turned their head so they could get another cartel. We now know they made a deal with a cartel in the United States so they could take out in Mexico, so they could take out the Sinaloa cartel. And it was like, you get these weapons, we'll send you these weapons, and we'll turn your head while you bring drugs into the United States. Now, most Americans don't want to accept that, but a lot of it went into the black community. When we look at the crack epidemic and all of that in the 80s, that was directly related to the U.S. going after Nicaragua, etc. And Americans don't understand that imperialism, that the United States doing these things, the United States is not fighting the drug war. It's part of a drug war on poor people, and that the people in the United States are suffering the same from U.S. policies. They don't care. Bring all the drugs you want, give them to the poor people in the United States, destroy their lives with heroin and cocaine, as long as you help us go after this boogeyman over here. Caleb.
Sure. And it's a similar thing with terrorism. If you look at Libya, there was no Al-Qaeda in Libya. There was no ISIS in Libya when Gaddafi was there building a socialist society. But the USA went in there and overthrew the socialist government. Now the terrorist groups have set up shop. Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab nationalist. He was no friend of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that. But the USA going in there and destabilizing it and destroying the Ba'athist Arab socialist government of Saddam Hussein and replacing it with instability and chaos, that led to the rise of terrorist groups. You talk about drugs. One of the Taliban has many, many problems, but one thing that they got right was they got rid of the opium issue. The poppy fields that sprung up all over Afghanistan in the 80s. That was one thing the UN and others praised the Taliban for. They got rid of that. Well, after the USA invaded and occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, the poppy fields sprung up. And there were instances where U.S. troops were caught, guarding those poppy fields and protecting them. And that all over the world, we do see that, when countries break free and become independent, they tend to get out of the terrorism business. They tend to get out of the drug trade. And they tend to start focusing on building up their domestic economy. But when a country faces, economic sanctions and when their government is toppled by the United States, the result is instability and chaos and the kind of situations that drive people into the drug trade. When you pour weapons into a region, throughout the 80s, the United States was just pouring weapons into Central America. The idea was that the government of Nicaragua, they were socialists and communists, and that can't be allowed. So just huge stockpiles of American weapons poured into Nicaragua. A lot of the groups that were working with the U.S. government to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua were involved in selling drugs. That has had an impact that just has gone on and on and on. I mean, if you look at the chaos happening in Mexico right now, these are drug gangs that can trace their roots back to when the United States was arming them to fight communism. And that makes us think, we're pouring all these weapons into Ukraine right now. I mean, all these weapons are pouring into Eastern Europe from the United States. And the studies, are coming out. We don't even know where these weapons are going. And it's going to have an impact for generations to come. When you just unload huge amounts of weapons into a region, that has the effect, it can go on for generations, the damage that is done by that. And that is the important thing we need to understand, is that Wall Street and London, they don't want to stabilize the world. They want to destabilize the world so that they can stay at the top. But it's Russia and China with their Belt and Road Initiative and their Eurasian Economic Union. They're the ones that are trying to build up the world. They're trying to build up Central Asia. They're trying to build up Africa. They want to bring economic development and stability to the world so that they can raise people out of poverty, so the world can become wealthier. However, Wall Street seems to want the world to stay poor so that they can stay rich. And U.S. foreign policy has been driven by that motivation. Keep the world poor so they can stay at the top of the game. And it's quite disturbing to see how they're operating.
Yeah, I think it is. And what we see now is with Ukraine, the U.S. is pumping all of these weapons allegedly into Ukraine. We see some of them ending up in Africa, all over the world, and arguing that they're, the usual, we're in there to fight the bad guys. It's always to fight the bad guys. And the big fight a lot of people don't understand this. There's a fight with the Republicans in Congress, having trouble seating a speaker. A big part of that, and, certainly I don't agree with I'm a lefty, so I don't agree with most anything the Republicans are saying, maybe one or two things every now and then. For the most part, no. But a big part of the argument was some of the MAGA people were mad because they wanted an inspector general. They said, if we're going to send all this money to Ukraine, we want somebody to look at where the money's going and to see exactly how much it's going. And a big fight was, no, they weren't going to do that. Now, let me add this. Let me add this article real quick. And give me a second. It's popping up. FTX founder reveals ties with Ukraine government and individuals. The founder and CEO of the collapsed cryptocurrency exchange FTX has admitted to cooperating with the Ukrainian government. In a CNN interview, Sam Bankman-Fried said that FTX had financial transactions with the Ukrainian government and individuals in recent months. We've seen millions of dollars go through the system we've given, Bankman said. I think that close to 1 million are sales as well. Bottom line is this. We now find it's tens of millions. We're giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, and they're investing it in crypto? And the government says, well, whatever happens, we don't want a person or anyone to look at how much money is being spent and where. It reminds me of these drug moves where the DEA would work with drug cartels to make money to spend it on other things. There's something fishy going on here, Caleb.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, people are wondering. I mean, the main concern coming from the Republican side is it looks like this was a case of illegal, bribery and lobbying, right? And this FTX guy, was a big donor to the Democrats. So it looks like the Ukrainians were giving him lots of money. He was then giving money to Democrats, and then Democrats were passing laws to give more money to Ukraine, and it was like a circle there, That's what it starts to look like. Now, obviously, the details aren't out yet, but the fact that this guy fled, and, it doesn't look good, let's put it that way. But when it gets down to it, I mean, that is the reason the United States can't stand Russia, is that Russia used to be impoverished and full of chaos. The 90s was an awful time in Russia, but when they stopped having crazy, neoliberal free market reforms, when they started asserting control over their economy and rebuilding themselves up, that's when they became an enemy. China used to be one of the poorest countries in the world. Now China has the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer, Huawei Technologies. They make half of the steel in the world. They have the fastest trains, the high-speed railway. China has had all these great breakthroughs, and they've done it by not simply letting the market run rampant. They have a big market sector, but they have 5-year economic plans. They have a huge amount of state-run industries, and even private companies in China are not free to do whatever the market says. The Communist Party and the government can step in at any time and tell them what to do, and that's why China has been able to eradicate extreme poverty. I mean, the achievements of China in terms of lifting people out of poverty are pretty astounding. I laugh about how Trump people say "Make America Great Again." Well, the Chinese Communist Party, their bragging point is they made China great again. This is a 5,000-year-old civilization, but after the British went in there with the Opium Wars and forced them to just have their economy be devastated by the domination of British and American banks. HSBC Bank, that's Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, that's a British bank that was set up to dominate the Chinese economy. They suffered a century of humiliation where their economy was held back. They say something like 100 million people died as a result of the domination of their economy by Western capitalism, but they broke free. And throughout the 20th century, they had a series of revolutions and uprisings that finally culminated in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party took power, and then in 1978, you had the reform and opening up, where they adjusted their socialism to bring in foreign investment, and they have done so much to just build their country back up and raise people out of poverty, and that socialism is about unleashing economic growth. And this is what people need to understand about capitalism. In systems of the past, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. In systems of the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. But capitalism is the only system where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where people are hungry because there is too much food. Now, this is a very, very irrational system. It's a system where production organized for profit leads to poverty. I always tell people the coal miner's riddle. There's a story about a coal miner, and his son is very cold. He says, "Father, why is it so cold?" And the father says, "Because I can't afford any coal to heat the stove." And he says, "Why can't you afford any coal to heat the stove?" And the father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." And the boy says to his father, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there's too much coal." That's the capitalist system. Poverty created by abundance. The more wealth that is created, the fewer people have jobs and the poorer people get. It's a frequent problem in capitalism of overproduction, meaning that the capitalist is trying to produce as many goods as he possibly can, but he wants to hire as few people as he can to make those goods and pay them as little as he possibly can to do it. And so he's not paying out in wages enough for the worker to buy back the product that he produces. And you frequently have this problem. And whenever you have a big technological leap, that leads to a long-term economic crisis. World War I came after a big, technological leaps that led to a big economic crisis. The Great Depression was largely caused by Henry Ford and his great breakthroughs in assembly line production. Suddenly, all over the world, the factories were churning out products more efficiently than ever before, and pretty soon you had a big crisis because abundance creates poverty. And now, we are living in a very, very deep, long-term economic crisis of capitalism caused by the computer revolution and the technological breakthroughs at the end of the 20th century, that came from the computer revolution. Artificial intelligence, 3D printers. We are better at making products than ever before, and as a result, there's more poverty than ever before. This is the irrationality of capitalism, and it shows the need for a rationally planned economy where the economy serves the people, not just the profits of a small group of owners.
If anybody wants to call in, the number is 202-588-0893, 202-588-0893. We're talking with Caleb Maupin. It's a new year. Feel free to call. You can ask about whatever you want, foreign policy, domestic policy, what's going on. One of the things that I think that's interesting is the United States couldn't possibly be a socialist country right now because it would overthrow itself, right? The U.S. is out there. The U.S. says socialism doesn't work. And then every socialist country, the United States tries to overthrow them. Well, it's hard to work when the U.S. is trying to overthrow you. And I'd say that to ask you about this. 2 words. Juan Guaido. For people who don't know about Juan Guaido, give us a little history. What do we need to know about Juan Guaido and what's happened with him recently?
Well, Juan Guaido was this individual in Venezuela who didn't support the government, and he was backed by the United States. He was an anti-communist activist, from a wealthy family, was involved in protests against the socialist government there, and during the Trump administration, the USA withdrew recognition from the internationally recognized official Venezuelan government, and they recognized this guy, this nobody, this figure, this obscure figure in Venezuela. They declared him to be the legitimate president of Venezuela. They said he was the interim president, legitimate president of Venezuela. And that was a huge attack on Venezuela. And then there were attempts, to overthrow the government to install this guy as the president. The United States gave funding and support to this guy as he was declaring himself a legit president. And just recently now, it appears that the Venezuelan opposition has stripped him of that title. He's no longer the interim president. And it appears the USA may be on the road back to recognizing the actual Venezuelan government. The reason probably has a lot to do with oil and the fact that because, we're not getting any Russian oil right now, and Russia is such a major oil exporter, we're going to make up for that by starting to get oil from Venezuela again. We had cut off so much Venezuelan oil for a while, but it looks like now the United States wants to start buying some of Venezuela's oil, so that'll require them to get friendlier with the actual Venezuelan government. But yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. This individual, Juan Guaido, was declared by the USA to be the legit leader of Venezuela, even though the Venezuelans never voted for him, even though the people of Venezuela recognized their own government, Nicolas Maduro, that Juan Guaido was never a popular figure, but because the United States was determined to overthrow the Venezuelan government, they picked this guy and said, we're going to recognize him as the president.
The number is 202-588-0893. We've got some callers. We're on with Caleb Maupin. He's an author. He is a political analyst. 202-588-0893. All callers, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping real quick. Do not set your phone down and walk away and listen on the radio or listen on the computer. There is a delay, and I will call for you, and you won't hear me because of the delay. You have to keep the phone to your ear. That's number one. Don't use speakerphones because they don't work well on radio. 202-588-0893. First caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hello?
You're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, Garland. This is Leo calling from Silver Spring, Maryland.
Great to talk to you, Leo. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having me first and foremost. Really, basically, I'm here to just state that I fully agree with all the statements that you and your guest made. I mean, hearing all that, it took me back to everything that I learned in class about, especially one of my classes were about the U.S. involvement in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Brazil, and I eventually even learned more about the atrocities that the U.S. has committed directly and indirectly, and I feel like what you mentioned about Venezuela, the Venezuela part, what your guest also mentioned about Venezuela's part of the U.S. government now being friendly all over again to with the legitimate government of Nicolas Maduro, only for the sake of the oil. It clearly indicates that the U.S. has this. Doesn't have this, genuine purpose. Doesn't have a genuine reason to reach out to countries whenever, to do actual business, to do a business that would benefit both countries alike.
Well, that's imperialism.
And whatnot.
That's imperialism. That's an empire. The empire never works to the benefit of both sides. The empire works to take, basically the U.S. goes to countries. The U.S. is, to me, the U.S. government is a criminal organization. Look at our history. We go to countries and we say, we want to give us your resources, and if you don't, we'll kill you. And if you give them to us, we'll probably kill you anyway. And then America comes back home and says to the dupes here, to the suckers in America, that guy over there is an authoritarian. That guy over there is a dictator. That guy's over there. And no matter how many times the American people are lied to, when the U.S. comes back with the same story, they want to steal somebody's stuff, the American people go, yeah, he's a dictator. That's kind of sickening.
It really is. It really is. I agree with you. And I have another question to ask.
Actually, we got other callers. I certainly appreciate you calling, Leo. But give me a call back next week, and we'll do that. All right. Thank you very much. That's Leo in Silver Spring, 202-588-0893. Next caller, you're on the air with Garland and Caleb Maupin.
Yes. How you doing?
Great.
Hakeem Jeffries made a statement about he's not going to bend the knee to democratic socialism. That told me right there that he's from the school of Stephen Fletcher. Explain to me what he meant by democratic socialism.
Well, if you look at his history, you just find out that he is a bank-owned, he is the part of the machine. He's what the people at the Black Agenda report call the black misleadership class. Let me ask you your thoughts on Hakeem Jeffries and his statements about democratic socialism, Caleb.
Well, I think he's referring to the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, which is an interesting development. I think many people were hoping that the Squad, AOC, and others would fight for jobs and health care, but they haven't done that. They've been a huge disappointment. And I think that when he refers to democratic socialism, he's referring to people that want more of a welfare state, want more economic benefits for the American people, ran for office on that platform, but then when they got to Congress, didn't fulfill it.
Yeah, he's never, I think Hakeem Jeffries is the guy that said, Israel now, Israel forever, Israel. When you hear that, then I got to throw my hands up in the air and say, come on, this is absurd. Israel is an apartheid state, and what is a black man doing supporting an apartheid state? Next caller, 202-588-0893. Next caller, you are on the air. What's your name? Where you calling from?
Hi, my name is Craig, and I'm calling from Silver Spring.
All right, Craig, what do you have to say?
Yeah, what you're talking about, I agree completely with what you guys are talking about. And it always frustrates me to hear and to know that all these other countries around the world always go along with the United States, like what you were saying about Venezuela and the sanctions, and even like with Israel. How come so many other countries are so basically afraid of the United States, in a sense? I mean,
Caleb,
that's a good question.
Well, I think the large development that we've seen in the last few decades is the opposite. I mean, most of the world recognizes Nicolas Maduro as the president of Venezuela. It's only a handful of U.S. allies and U.S. puppets that went along with the United States and recognized Juan Guaido. And if you look at when it comes to the Ukraine stuff, I mean, the African continent is largely unwilling to vote with the United States against Russia at the United Nations. And there's a number of countries like India, like Turkey, that, have said to the United States, even Saudi Arabia and Israel, a long-time U.S. allies in the Middle East, have said to the United States, we're not really with you on this one. So I think that the world is largely changing. But the United States has been the top dog in the global economy for a long time. And if you don't go along with the United States, they have a way of making your life miserable, imposing sanctions on you, etc. They are the center of the world economy, and that's why they're fighting so hard against Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and countries like that, because they're trying to get a more multipolar world where it's not just the world being centered around Wall Street and London. There are other sources of power in the global economy.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Next caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from? Oh, our next caller's not there for some reason. I hope they didn't set the phone down.
Hello, I'm here.
Oh, okay. That's Rick from Germany. I'm all ears, Rick. Your thoughts?
I have a question for your guest. This will probably be my last call to your show and your station, Garland, because costs are going through the roof here in Europe, and talking on the telephone ain't cheap.
Wow.
My question concerns the environmental issue. Do you think the sixth mass extinction event will get the attention of the most conservative and militaristic white men there in America?
Thank you very much, Rick. Caleb, your thoughts?
Well, I think that the environment is an issue we should all be concerned about, and that a lot of the ways we interact with our environment are not sustainable. We clearly need to get beyond fossil fuels. I'm really excited about fusion energy and getting to a higher energy source that would, be better and more efficient and more long-term. But that said, I think that largely the climate hysteria is a tool that the United States is using to keep the world poor. I mean, they go to African countries and they want to build a power plant to build up their economy, and we say, oh, you can't do that. That's bad for the environment. They did to Sri Lanka. They forced Sri Lanka to adopt organic fertilizer, and it destroyed their crop output. And that in the name of environmentalism, the Wall Street class is trying to use that to hold back development. The answer to the environmental problems is not to go lower and reduce consumption. That's called Malthusianism, and that's not good. The answer is to go higher and to explore fusion energy, to try and unleash human creativity, to have a more efficient and sustainable world economy. And that a lot of the forces that are pushing what you can call degrowth or climate hysteria, or the idea that we should have less, or pushing this theory of overpopulation, which is one of the most despicable racist theories that's been pushed by the Imperialists and the British Empire for a long time. A lot of those forces don't have a good agenda. They claim to be concerned about the environment, but they're really concerned about keeping Wall Street at the top.
You make a good point, and because I'm a person, I'm an environmentalist, and I feel like we've got to deal with the environmental problems that we're causing, or we're all going to be in a bad way if we're even lucky to be here at all. However, that being said, the government of the United States and these neoliberals, they will use any tool they can to get what they want. So when I say we got climate issues, we need to address them, I mean we got climate issues, we need to address them. When they say we got climate issues, we need to address them, what they mean is, I have another tool. How can we use this to bilk the people to take everything they got? So it's not that Garland Nixon is opposed to climate issue. I'm 100% in favor of it. I'm just trying to tell people who really are concerned about climate and pollution and all these things, which we should all be concerned about, understand that the people who have all these billions of dollars, they ain't trying to fix it. The United States is not trying to do anything about fossil fuel except make more money off of it. The U.S. is one of the top fossil fuel producers in the world. They ain't trying to reduce fossil fuel. They're trying to convince you that they're trying to do that, but they're not trying to do that. 202-588-0893. Next caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Tabu from Washington.
All right.
I thank you so much, Garland, and your guest. And Garland, you're so right when you focus on our government. And I'd like for your guest to help us identify more specifically who it is that our government is controlled by. It's not controlled by the people. The United States is a country of freedom, life, and liberty. I think there's a difference between capitalism, crony capitalism. But please help us identify who it is that controls our government going around the world, killing the wars and all that. This is not what the people want. And you're right. So let's focus on the problem. Who is it in our government that is wrong?
That's a tremendous question. You know what? And I tell you why, Caleb, because intuitively, people are looking at Joe Biden stumble around. People are looking at the government. They're looking at the similarity between the so-called two parties. And people are starting to say, you know what? I think there's people controlling this government that we can't see. Who are really controlling this government? People are intuitively, they can feel something's rotten in Denmark. When someone asks you that question, Caleb Maupin, who is it that's really controlling our government? How do you answer it?
Well, I think that our government is very much controlled by the big banks and the big monopolies and the Wall Street corporations. I talk about the oil bankers. Some people have pointed out, when you talk about you ask who's the richest person in the world. People say Jeff Bezos, Carlos Slim, Bill Gates. And some people laugh and they say, those guys are so poor they have to keep their money in their own name. If you look at like the Rockefellers, the descendants of John D. Rockefeller, they have tried to calculate how much money the Rockefeller family has. They can't figure it out because it is so vast and wrapped up in so many different cartels and trusts and foundations. They can't even tell how much money they have. You think about the Morgans, right? The House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan and his descendants, how much money they have. That's General Electric, and they have so much money it's beyond our comprehension. The Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Mellons, the Vanderbilts, some of these entrenched, powerful families, a lot of whom are based out of New England. Those folks have more money than we can even imagine. The amount of wealth they have is incalculable, and they can get what they want in politics. Absolutely, they have the power to get things done and to shut things down and to craft political discourse to their liking.
Well,
yes, caller.
That is the problem. Congress is being bought. He's touched right on it. Congress is being bought. They listen to corporations, big money. They don't listen to the people. That's our problem. Let's begin to focus on that. And I think if you look at the policies of the Biden administration versus the last one, who are trying to straighten this stuff out. So let's get rid of, as they say, drain the swamp.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got some open lines, 202-588-0893, 202-588-0893. We're talking with Caleb Maupin. And Caleb, the other thing that I find interesting, I can't get into the pillow fights between the two parties. They're like, hey, January 6th, the Republicans did this. Hey, the border, the Democrats are doing this at the border. And I look at it and I'm like, well, let's start here. The problem at the border is caused by the United States. If you look at the countries where the people are at the border, we destabilize their countries. We overthrow their governments. We steal all of their stuff. We impoverish the country because of imperialism, right? So we go to a country, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, you name it. Well, not Nicaragua anymore. They're doing actually well. But El Salvador, Guatemala, etc. We impoverish these countries. Haiti, overthrow their governments, steal all their resources. And then the people show up at our border and we say, look at these people at our border. How dare them show up at our border? We have to deal with the border issue. But what we won't even have a discussion about is the U.S. policies that have destabilized an entire region. And that's the reason they're showing. And neither of the two parties, if there is such thing as two parties, nobody on Capitol Hill will talk about the actual reason. Caleb.
Sure. And, from the right, we just get bigotry. Oh, these immigrants are dirty. They're all criminals. Send them back where they came from. And from the left, we get this celebration. Oh, this is great. So many people are coming to our country. This is the American dream. Let's acknowledge the reality of the situation. Millions of people can't live in their own country. Things in Central America have gotten so bad that people are fleeing en masse. There are whole regions where people don't speak Spanish. They speak indigenous languages. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity. They don't have schools. Drug violence has made their life unsustainable, and this is because of U.S. foreign policy. And they're fleeing their homes. And every day they find dead bodies along the U.S. border of people that are fleeing. And they're not fleeing communism. They're fleeing free market capitalism. They're fleeing neoliberalism. They're fleeing the results of U.S. regime change operations in that region. And neither side really wants to talk about that. The wave of migrants and refugees, not just facing this country from Central America, but facing Europe from the Middle East, this is rooted in the failure and the regime change operations and the destabilization caused by the domination of the world by Western capitalism.
202-588-0893. Callers, we got more callers. You're on the air with Garland Nixon and Caleb Maupin. Next caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where you calling from?
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Kimberly. I'm calling from Fort Washington.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you. First of all, love the show. Garland, I call you my history professor, so thank you for my weekly history lesson. I wanted to ask you both. Garland, you mentioned that Israel is an apartheid state. I would like for you to touch on that a little, maybe a little, your thoughts and opinions on that and some history behind that. And thank you so much, Caleb, for all of your research and your expertise.
Great. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Let me say this about Israel. What is up with Israel? I'll tell you what Paul Robeson Jr.'s position was on Israel. He said, look, it's not about religion. It's not about here's what it's about. Alexander Haig referred to Israel as the America's unsinkable battleship in the Middle East. The United States does all of the money and military and all of those things. They consider Israel a military base. You know what is in the Middle East? Oil, lots of oil and more oil. And so the United States does not care how many Palestinians are slaughtered, how the vicious, brutal, Israel has pretty much instituted, look it up, a fascist government right now, an absolute fascist, brutal government against the, the way they treat the Palestinians is, unthinkable, unspeakable. And I'm speaking about it, so I feel guilty. But yes, it's all about the United States keeping Israel as a military base in the Middle East. Your thoughts, Caleb?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. The crimes of Israel against the Palestinians have been condemned by the United Nations over and over and over again. The Arab world and all across the planet, really, there's outrage about what Israel does, but Israel gets a free pass from the United States. It gets loads of weapons, billions of dollars in our taxpayer money, loads of military support and political support, because it's key in helping, the United States dominate the world and have influence in that region that's very strategic because of the oil. And it's absolutely outrageous. And, I'd like to see divestment from Israel. I'd like to see, boycotting of Israeli corporations. I'd like to see, people take a stand and say we don't approve of what Israel's doing.
202-588-0893. Next caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, thanks. Good show so far. I think one of the best ways to break up the two-party system is the emergence of a strong third party. And there have only been two people that had the ability to do that. Bernie Sanders, when he first ran, and when the Democrats robbed him, and Dr. Jill Stein offered Bernie Sanders to come in and be their head, their front runner, the head of that party. If Bernie Sanders would have done that at the height of his popularity when he first ran, then that would have been the birth of a strong third party. The other person who has a massive following that has the potential to do that also, I may not like everything he says and what he does, that's Donald Trump, because he has that same massive following. So I think if people start figuring out a way to break up the two-party system by having the emergence of a third powerful party, I think that would help in a lot of ways, because then it's more competition instead of the same two corporate parties that we have. I know that time is almost running out, so that's what I want to hear. Like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Caleb, one thing I remember was Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida, and when she was being challenged and some other Democrats were being challenged in Florida, they joined with the Republicans. And the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress worked together in Florida to hold off people who were challenging them. So these Democrats will tell you how much they hate the Republicans, and the Republicans how much they hate the Democrats. But what they really want is to maintain their seat, to maintain power. And they will work together if they both think they're going to maintain power, because this business about the Republicans hate the Democrats and the Democrats hate the Republicans, it's a show. It is It's like when you go to a play. At the end of the play, the curtain comes up. And you know what? The villain comes out. The hero comes out. The guy that got killed in scene 3, he comes out. The guy that was the milkman in scene 1 who only had a couple lines, they all come out and hold hands together and they all bow. Because you know what? It was just a play. None of it was real. Caleb.
I agree, and I think that the two major parties in the United States, they both carry out the same agenda, which is grinding the country into further poverty. And part of the way that they've carried this out is by playing demographics in the population against each other. Red states versus blue states, urban folks versus rural folks, small town folks versus big city folks, the South versus the North. I mean, they're trying to, whipsaw the country and play different sections of the country against each other so they can make the whole country poorer and enrich more profits for themselves.
Next caller, 202-588-0893. Next caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where you calling from?
Hey, how you doing? Darnell from Alexandria. Hey, I'm a little late getting into the show, but I would like to know, I don't know if you touched on this earlier, can you give us a history of the origins of the capitalism that we have now, which came from Europe, and like a little historical context in that? I greatly appreciate that.
Caleb, I know you can do that.
Well, I think it's really important to talk about how capitalism began, because I've seen a lot of people say, well, socialism is theft, they say. These capitalists, they just worked hard and they earned it. Well, that's a lie. Capitalism began with mass theft. The origin of capitalism was the slave trade, the continental slave trade, the theft of this country from the Native Americans, the clearing of the commons in Europe, where these peasants who lived on the land for hundreds of years were suddenly kicked off the land and told they had to go find a job and pay rent, and that the whole history of the birth of capitalism was with mass theft. The land was taken and turned into private property for the wealthy. The colonialism and the seizure of different parts of the world by Western colonizers. Capitalism began with mass theft on a mass scale. Before that, you had feudalism, which was a system where you have nobles and landowners and peasants and serfs. And as a result of the Silk Road coming in from China and trade from Asia, as a result of inventions like the printing press, which was first on the Korean Peninsula, but it was brought to the United States. It was brought to Western Europe by Marco Polo and the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of different events. They laid the basis for a new class emerging, a merchant class emerging, and those folks, they seized control of the governments of Europe, and they overturned feudalism, and they created the capitalist system, and they did it with mass theft and murder and genocide, and they killed lots and lots of people. Capitalism began with mass genocide and destruction, turning the common property, the commons of feudalism, into the private property of a small group of rich people.
Caleb, another thing is Americans don't realize our own history and how brutal and how vicious that this system is. Let me give you an example. I've got a book in my hand right now I love to read, and it's called The Plot to Seize the White House. It's by Jules Archer, the shocking true story of the conspiracy to overthrow FDR. If you look at the history of this brutal system we live under, what happened? When there was a lefty leader, they either killed him or tried to take him out. If you go backwards, right, I could start naming Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Okay, they took them out. RFK was going to be president. He was somewhat of a lefty. They killed him. JFK was a lefty. They killed him. FDR, they attempted to overthrow the government. And Lincoln, the United States pretends like one guy kind of wandered up and he came up with a plot to kill Lincoln. That was a full assassination plot to overthrow the government. There was another guy and his name was Lewis Powell. He went to kill the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. At the same time, another guy named George Atzerodt went to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. There was a plot. In fact, 5 people were hanged as a result of the assassination plot to take out the entire Lincoln government, because Lincoln was a lefty. The history tells us there's very powerful figures playing here, and if a lefty is in power, or if someone is in power who's trying to act toward on behalf of the people, that these forces become very violent. Your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, sure, and often, these leaders start out, they're not, particularly left-wing. Lincoln said he didn't want to abolish slavery, he just didn't want it to expand. But that was too much for the slaveholders, and they took up arms against him. So Abraham Lincoln was forced to form a coalition, and he made Harriet Tubman the first woman to ever lead U.S. troops into battle, and he even had a communist general in his army, a guy named August Willich, who became a brigadier general, and he was a communist, a friend of Karl Marx, who was born in Germany, and he became a general in the Union Army. There was a whole communist division of the Union Army during the Civil War called the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment, and they waved a red flag as their emblem. Roosevelt, he was facing that business plot, the fascist coup against him, and that forced him to become more and more friendly with the labor unions. And he had communist labor union activists come over to the White House. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, spoke at communist youth gatherings and such, and that because of the fact that he was facing opposition, he had to create things like Social Security and protect labor unions, and that these divisions among the elite can create an opening for the people. And they're very important to understand that when the elite are fighting with each other, that creates an opening for the people to get politically active and make their own demands.
Caleb Maupin, where can people find you online?
I'm on YouTube, Caleb Maupin, Caleb Maupin. I'm also on Rockfin, just like you. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all social media. I'm Caleb Maupin. You can also check out the Center for Political Innovation, which is the think tank I work with. That's cpiusa.org. cpiusa.org. That's the Center for Political Innovation.
All right, Caleb, thanks a lot. I want to say at Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, Garland Nixon on Facebook, and you can email me, GarlandN, that's Garland and the letter N, at gmail.com. My main man, Khalil, is on, and he's going to give us some house music. I love my house music. I picked a great song to get us out of here. Khalil, make it happen. I'm out.